This video looks at the second booklet from the Unit 3 course, the Distribution of Organisms Biodiversity section. So our first learning intention was to find out about biodiversity and the factors that affected biodiversity. So to remind us, it's the term used to describe the variety and abundance of plants and animals in an ecosystem. So how many different species are there, and how many of each are there? This is affected by things like the biotic factors, abiotic factors, and human activities. So human activities quite often end up affecting the biotic and abiotic factors, and then that's what affects the distribution of organisms. So some of these factors can increase the biodiversity and some of them will decrease it. We'll talk a little bit about abiotic and biotic factors, and then I'll discuss why these might affect the distribution of organisms and the biodiversity. So abiotic factors are non-living factors. That doesn't mean things that are dead. That's not what we mean by non-living. It's things like the pH, which is the concentration of hydrogen ions in an area, or the temperature, or wind speed, or moisture content. All these things that, I mean, water is not alive. Things within water can be alive, but water itself is not. Heat, temperature, these are not living things, but they massively affect what can live in an area. So these are some of our abiotic factors. So organisms can only survive in the ecosystem if there's the correct combination of abiotic factors. This is something that actually, when people get their head around it, they understand quite well. It's biotic factors they tend to struggle with slightly. We understand that cactuses don't like to be overwatered because they have evolved to be adapted to quite a low moisture, hot, kind of sandy, arid area. We know that fish, conversely, quite like water. We know that some fish quite like salty water and are marine, so they live in the sea, and some can't stand salty conditions and have to live in fresh water. So really, it's quite intuitive for us. We understand fish need to live in water. That is an abiotic factor that they need. And we understand that cactuses do not want to live in water. And we understand intuitively that's an abiotic factor they need. So really, abiotic factors and their effect on biodiversity we get. And because in extreme environments, very hot or very cold, very dry, very wet areas, only some species can really adapt to fill those niches. We tend to get quite a low biodiversity in very extreme abiotic conditions, very wet, very dry, very salty, very hot, very acidic, very alkaline. Biotic factors is things like number of prey, number of predators. So the number of living things in an area is quite a good measure of a biotic factor, but also how close together they are grouped. People tend to get a bit confused around density. So population density is a biotic factor. All that means, and you can imagine it, if you have a field that is the size of your bedroom and you have one sheep in it, it's probably going to struggle to live in that bedroom. Whereas if you had a field that was maybe the size of the entire top floor of the school, you can maybe get a sheep. That's maybe enough land, maybe enough space that one sheep, if that was all grassed, could maybe manage to slowly munch its way around. And by the time it got back to where it started, there is more grass to eat and more water. Two sheep in that area, you've now half the amount of space each of those sheep has. And by doubling the population in that area, that has made it more dense with sheep. If you put 15 sheep in an area the size of any of the floors of our, especially the top floor of our building, that's not enough space. They are too closely packed together, too dense, and that's what we mean by population density. So the more organisms that are packed together in an area, that will affect how many organisms you can get there and the biodiversity. Population density also affects things like parasites and contagions. So if you pack 20 sheep into a small area, things like fleas and ticks, diseases, foot rot, all these kind of things will spread much easier than if they're spread out quite far apart. So this is why these kind of biotic factors can have a big impact on not just how many of one species you have, but if you're packing cows and horses and sheep and donkeys and goats into quite a small field, that's not really going to be sustainable. You'll end up with one, maybe two different species that can live in that area. The most kind of successful competitors, if we remember our interspecific competition from the last videos, they will be the ones that manage to survive there. So we'll find out how biotic factors affect the distribution of organisms, so where the organisms are found. Grazing is something that actually most people understand but don't think they do, again. So grazing is like cutting your grass, basically. It's carried out by animals naturally, like rabbits, sheep, horses, donkeys, goats, things like that. And it really, really affects the variety of plant species. So low grazing, that means that if we think about it from a human and from an animal point of view, low grazing in an animal point of view would be there's not a lot of the grass getting eaten by herbivores. So there's maybe one cow in quite a big field. Timmy the cow, he doesn't get round, yeah, he will say, doesn't get round to any particular area of grass very often. So actually, that area has a lot of opportunities to grow between grazing. And what we tend to find is that in low grazing, very aggressive dominant plants are not kept in check. So plants that are constantly chomping at the bit to grow, they're able to just get massive and spread. If you think about dock leaves and a lot of other things that have big leaves, they sprint up, grow really, really big, really, really quickly, and shade out the light for all other smaller, slower growing plants that are trying to get through. So if you don't graze enough, the bullies of the plant world will grow up really quickly. So you get a low biodiversity of just the dominant plants. Moderate, so occasional grazing. So aggressive species they have their heads literally chopped off regularly, kind of often. It means that while they are still able to grow, other plants are also getting a chance to grow up to that height before the grazing occurs. So you get a bit of a higher biodiversity because all of the plants are getting the opportunity to grow. And then very high levels of grazing. If that cow is in a 5 by 5 meter spread, it's constantly going over the same bit, same bit, same bit, same bit. And even the aggressive species are struggling to get their heads above the ground before Timmy's back eating them again. So it's really only the most aggressive, strong, hardy plants that have growth points that are probably underneath the soil, so Timmy can't actually get at the point that they grow from. They're the only ones that survive. Another analogy would be mowing the grass. So if you don't mow the grass very often, as some of us don't, you'll get a big variety of weeds growing in your garden, unfortunately. If you mow the grass every so often, you maybe get a low variety of weeds. So in the summer, if you mow your grass every 3 or 4 weeks, you get, that probably counts as moderate grazing. You get your grass, but you also get dandelions and daisies and anything else that has had weed seeds into your garden that with high levels of grazing you wouldn't notice. Yeah. And then high grazing, if you mowed your grass 5 times a day, you'd probably only have grass because the weed seeds would never get a chance to actually grow up to the point that they themselves could then produce seeds and spread across your land. There's also an analogy for school. So if instead of grazing you have behaviour management, if the teacher never does any behaviour management, only you tend to get a few kids who kind of dominate the entire class. Nobody's being kept in check, and really the lesson is all about these kids because no one's keeping them in check. Moderate, so teachers who aren't screaming at everyone all the time, but are keeping the behaviour reasonable, everyone gets a chance to flourish in that environment. And very high levels of grazing. That teacher who has not had their coffee and is always angry and sad and unreasonable and just don't know what's going on, really no one is thriving in that environment, and probably only the most dominant kids are getting any attention at all. Sad. As the number of prey increases, the number of predators here, so prey and predators, prey increases, the number of predators will go up. You'll notice there's always more prey than there are predators. We talk about that in the next key area. This causes the number of prey to start to decrease because the number of predators have gone up, so the prey are getting eaten. After time, this causes the number of predators to decrease because their food supply has gone down. This in turn allows the prey to start to increase in number. So it's an oscillating thing. The prey numbers go up, which means that it's not actually that the predators produce more offspring, it's that the offspring they produce don't die, which is a bit sad. If a fox produces 4 cubs and there's only enough rabbits to go around for the fox plus 2, 2 of its cubs are going to die of starvation, unfortunately, or need to move to other areas to succeed. Whereas if there's a glut of rabbits, everyone can survive. And all of those kids can have kids, and all of those kids can have kids, and all of those kids can have, oh no, the rabbits are gone. And then everyone dies, except for the strongest, which means the rabbits start doing well. And then, oh, kids are surviving, yay, yay, yay. Oh no, all the rabbits are dead. And then all the foxes die. It's a bit of a shame. So you get this kind of oscillating reaction. Human activities can affect this as well. So habitat destruction, humans are bad for deciding they want an area of land and chopping down all the trees. If you think about the rainforest, you see these orangutans trying to fend off big diggers. Very sad, because humans have decided they want that area. A lot of animals have lived in very niche areas for quite a long time, and they can only live in those kind of areas. And if you chop down all the trees, something that needs to live in a tree is not going to do well. Hunting, again, if we want to eat you, or we want to chop off your horn or your fin just because we feel like it, that's not great, and it's going to decrease these really kind of exotic animals down to extinction. Overfishing, so we tend to fish down the food chain quite a lot. So we start throwing our rods in or our nets down, and we take out the biggest, juiciest fish. When we deplete those big, juicy fish down to the point where we can no longer really catch them very often, we start fishing for the next biggest thing, and the next biggest thing, and the next biggest thing. And if you do that intensively enough, you can actually fish it right down so that there's no fish surviving. Because if you fish the big ones down to the point where you're unlikely to catch them, as they start to come back up in population, so as their fry and whatever start to grow to get bigger, if you've already started to fish down the food chain, you're probably fishing their prey out from under them. So by the time they get to the point where they're big enough to start hunting again, there's no food, so they go extinct. The thing that you fish down underneath them, again, you're already 5 animals down the food chain by this point, so you get this kind of runaway reaction where you've always kind of gotten rid of the thing just down the food chain from the previous one, and it goes extinct. Pollution, again, plastic and chemical and all these other types of pollution are bad. Animals that require specific environmental conditions in order to survive need those conditions. So if we change the pH balance, if we change all these other things, they're going to die. And the exotic pet trade, people like things. They like to buy things that are pretty, and they don't always really respect those animals. You, for example, shouldn't have a massive whale in an area that is about the same length as it. Whales need massive areas to kind of romp around in, swim around in. But in America, especially, there's kind of water parks that have these animals in tiny little pens in captivity. So if you keep stealing all these animals from the environment, eventually they will go extinct and die out, which is not great, and it reduces the biodiversity and upsets nature. So we've kind of talked a little bit about this, the effect of abiotic and biotic factors. So indicator species are ones which by their presence or absence indicate a level of pollution. So sewage and other organic waste provides food for bacteria and allows them to grow and multiply. When bacteria feed on sewage, they use up oxygen in the water. This means that there's less oxygen for other organisms which die or decrease in number. Eventually, the bacteria run out of food when they've broken down all the waste and their numbers decrease. This gradually returns the oxygen levels back to normal, and other species will reappear again. Certain freshwater invertebrates reveal information about the level of pollution of fresh water. Rivers that are not polluted have higher biodiversity, of freshwater invertebrates. The abiotic factor, that should be affecting, not effecting. An effect is a noun and affect is a verb, in case you wonder. The level of biodiversity in the freshwater is an example. Is the level of pollution in the water. So pollution. And then there's an example here. You can get things like what they call like maggot shrimps and stuff that are in very polluted areas, and freshwater things like stonefly nymphs in polluted areas. So if a sewage work puts its waste out here, you'd probably find in number 1, before you get to the sewage works, there's a high biodiversity of invertebrates, and then 2, it's only the hardiest, hardy and mid. So as an example here, the conclusion from this table is the further you get from the city centre, the higher percentage cover of trees you get for lichen. That suggests that that could be to do with something like pollution, from things like sulfur dioxide. So if you looked at a tree and it had 65%, you could actually probably suggest you're about 7 miles from the city. And if you made a graph that joined percentage of lichen to pollution, you could use that as a kind of calibration curve. You could say there are 45% lichen on this tree, and from my experiments, I know that that likely means that there is 23% sulfur dioxide in the air. So as you move further away from the city, the percentage of lichen increase. So hopefully we understand biodiversity. It's the kind of the range and abundance of different species in an ecosystem. We understand abiotic factors, biotic factors, and how they affect the distribution of organisms. We've described the effect that these have on biodiversity and distribution, and that different human activities affect biodiversity. You don't need to know specific examples for the exam, but you need to understand the concept, and if they gave you examples, be able to apply them to your knowledge of biodiversity. We know indicator species are species which, by their presence or absence, indicate environmental quality / levels of pollution. Hopefully that makes some kinds of sense. I know I tend to ramble a little bit, but if there's anything in particular you're stuck with, please ask me specific questions.